Hello and a very warm welcome to Referendum TV. Today on the couch I'm joined by Professor Joe Goldblatt, who's here speaking for himself and no one else at this moment. Welcome, Joe, how are you?
Thank you, Kevin. I'm very well, or as the Scots say, not so bad.
Good start. You speak the lingo then, eh? How long have you been here?
This is our 8th year.
8th year, and you obviously enjoy it.
We love Scotland. We're retiring here.
All right, but you're originally from Dallas, Texas.
That's right. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, went to school in Austin, Texas University, and then moved to Washington, D.C. to find my fame and fortune, and I found a wife. And now we've been married 37 years and have 2 children.
Sam and Max, that's good to hear. You were actively involved in the Yes campaign.
Yes, very much involved from the very beginning. I think the reason I became involved initially is because my father, may he rest in peace, was a city councilman. Actually, the first Jewish city councilman in Dallas, Texas. He ran for council and lost by an overwhelming majority because in those days, all of the voting was through an at-large system, so the people on the other side of town who didn't know him voted against him. It might have been the religion, it might have been he was on the poorer side of town, who knows. But my father, in losing, learned how to win. Kevin, he went all the way to the Supreme Court with a lawsuit in the United States, Goldblatt versus the city of Dallas. And the lawsuit was to change the voting from the at-large system to single-member districts. So his friends and neighbors would be allowed to vote for him, for their councilman. One man, one vote. It's very similar to what we've been doing here in Scotland in terms of independence.
I'm confused about the at-large. That's lots of different people on a big sheet.
That's people from all over the city running for city council, but everyone in the city votes for everyone.
Right.
Rather than people just in your community, your neighborhood, voting for their city councilman. So it's very similar to the issue with Scotland and Westminster. This is about self-determination. This is about the ability to elect our own decision makers rather than just one person that is of the leading party.
Big shoes to follow.
Yeah, and Papa actually, when he ran the next time, he won by a small percentage. The third time, by an overwhelming majority. So I think I come by this independence quite naturally.
It was with the cornflakes in the morning.
That's right.
That's good.
Right.
That's good. You're taking on the US and winning. That's pretty amazing. In terms of the result and the aftermath, what's your thoughts?
Well, I am emboldened by it. I am absolutely emboldened. 95% of our population registered to vote. 85% actually voted, probably the highest in Europe. And 45% voted for the right part of the ballot. To get to that 45%, we had none of the powers. We used not one moment of scaremongering. We didn't rattle one saber. It was a quiet, peaceful, positive campaign. I'm so proud of the people that ran the Yes campaign. I'm so proud of our elected officials. So I believe that not only did we, in the end of the day, we won that election by the percentage that we gained, and the next time, which I believe will be sooner than later, we will win.
Why?
Well, the short answer is...
Oh, go for a long answer.
Well, the short answer is because I happen to be of the Jewish religion. One of the books in the Old Testament is Exodus. One of the most fundamental rights of humanity is the ability to be free, to make one's own determination, not to live with oppression. And while we have not been unduly oppressed, we do not have the full ability to make our own economic decisions. And so I believe more and more people will see this.
And do you think that'll come to light? And this is perhaps the longer answer. Do you think that'll come to light with the delivery or non-delivery within the more powers?
Absolutely, and it will be the non-delivery.
Right.
Because you see through a coalition already the unraveling of these promises, of these vows. By unraveling, I mean people disagreeing with one another, Nick Clegg disagreeing with David Cameron disagreeing with Ed Miliband Ed Miliband not able to follow through on certain promises. So it's already starting to unravel. And I think what's going to happen is the people who were in the majority the last time, the 55%, are going to convert once they see how very difficult these cuts from Westminster are going to be. For example, I heard the other day from the chief executive of the Edinburgh Council, we're facing £500 million in cuts in Edinburgh. That's cuts to our senior citizens, our wee bairn, our children, the arts, the social services, in a country that is the 20th wealthiest country in the world, Scotland. It's unconscionable, yes.
It's a lot of money, and it'll feed through into lots of different projects throughout the city.
Lots of pain is coming.
And you were one of the founding signatories of, or you were the founder of Academics for Yes.
I was one of the founders. Stephen Watson, Professor Stephen Watson at University of Glasgow, came up with the idea, and he contacted me, and then we co-opted Brian McGregor, who's a vice principal at Aberdeen University, and Murray Piddock, who's a deputy principal at Strathclyde University, and created this coalition of now over 200 academics for Yes.
So given that brain power, what went wrong?
Well, the short answer is, I believe, and this is not a careful analysis by demographic or socioeconomic voters, etc., but I believe that the people at Westminster were very effective with scaremongering. And while that was not the nature of the Yes campaign, our nature was not to be offensive but to be defensive. So that when someone came forward with something that was negative, we would show through evidence, academic evidence, that this indeed would not see the light of day. I think the next time we need to use our academic evidence to really paint the picture of how dour times could be if we don't get this done the next time.
It might not need to happen because it'll be proved with the unfolding of austerity cuts.
Well, it could be, absolutely, and that evidence will unfold naturally. The other thing that could happen, Kevin, as I understand, there could be a parliamentary decision about independence. So, for example, in the next election, if the SNP, of which I am a proud member and on the executive of the SNP Edinburgh Central Branch, if we have the majority, again, a significant majority, we may do this, or it could be done, I believe, from what I've read, through parliamentary action.
So that's a Jim Siller's argument that there's a mandate, if there's a significant mandate, so the bulk of the MPs returning are SNP or pro-independence, then we make moves to create that situation.
Right, it's not the ideal solution because a democratic solution with a ballot is the best solution, but it depends upon how bad this austerity becomes. If we see, for example, when I was doing campaigning for the referendum in council housing blocks, if we see the further dismantling of the social fabric of this nation, and it leads to greater deprivation, I think our politicians have to do the responsible thing and take greater control over our economic future.
So they would morally have to take charge and make a decision.
Yes, and this is what makes Scotland different from England, among many other things culturally. In Scots law, which is different, as you know, from English law, we have a provision called justice with mercy. You may recall when Mr. McGrahy was released from prison, returned to his home country, there was a lot of controversy about that.
International condemnation, I think.
Absolutely. But those who condemned did not understand the unique nature of Scots law. And in our law, we have a provision for justice, to temper justice with mercy. And I would think that that's what I would expect my parliament to do, to take control of the moral fabric of this country and reweave it together.
When you speak, one of the things I notice consistently is your use of the word we, ours, and mine, or my, in terms of Scotland. So born in Dallas and travelled all around the States, educated, met Nancy in Washington, but yet you take ownership of Scotland. Why is that?
I think even though we have no Scottish ancestry, we found a life here that, given the economic crisis of 2007-8 and the rest of the world,
Yeah.
that we thought was being addressed in a profound way, focusing on social values. I guess at 62 years of age, I would describe myself now as a social democrat. And it's interesting, in the United States, I never belonged to a political party. Even though I produced events for the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, I never officially joined a party. I always registered as an independent.
Right.
But 1 year ago, I joined the SNP because those values resonate deep within me. The values of removing Trident from our country so that we can grow up in what I believe will be a safer country for my children and hopefully one day grandchildren.
When did you start to take ownership? When did it become your country? Because it's an interesting transition from being American, obviously travelling all over the world, and then landing here, and all of a sudden you think I belong here.
It's a really good question, and as I think about it, I really believe one of the turning points was Alex Salmond's speech after the second SNP election in which we achieved a majority.
2011.
Yes, in which he said, and I quote, "Higher education, will there ever be fees implemented as there are down south?"
Yeah.
And he said, quoting Robert Burns, "The rocks will melt." And I thought, I've been looking all my life for a politician with that kind of integrity, with that kind of gravitas, those kind of social values. And I really think, Kevin, that was a turning point for me, that I found in our First Minister and our Deputy First Minister and this Parliament values that I want to embrace for the rest of my life.
Isn't that wonderful? I mean, basically, it's a country of the mind. Scotland, in a sense, whilst it's got wonderful geography and people, what you've been attracted to is the country of the mind, which is based on those values of social democracy and giving people a fair go, which is again interesting in terms of echoes from the Enlightenment past of Edinburgh in particular.
Some also say democratic intellectual pursuit, because when I stood in front of stalls during the campaign the last 2 years on Saturday morning, it reminded me of the 1970s in Dallas, Texas, when I was campaigning for my father as a young man, and people would stop you on the street and ask you about issues. Now, all that's gone away because of social media, but in Edinburgh, it was alive. Whether it be Stockbridge, the West End, Gorgie, Dalry, people would stop me and say...
Can I just say, if you come to me for a wee second, that's one of the only people I know from out with Scotland that can pronounce Gorgie correctly and Dalry correctly, as opposed to Dalry or Gogie.
Yeah.
So very well done,
Well,
Joe. Very impressed with that.
Thank you. My father, his generation, would meet on a corner and have what we would call here a stairwell ramming. You know? I don't see that as much anymore in the United States. What a thrill it was to have people approach me in Stockbridge and say, "What about pensions? What about the NHS?"
I think Stockbridge was fairly pro-no.
Well, yes, except in the end days,
Yeah.
we went from people ignoring us to people saying, "Where do I sign the declaration?"
Really?
So there really was a conversion everywhere in this country. I mean, we only had at the start of the campaign about 20% yes voters. You remember that?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it was 45%. Again, without the money, without the power, without anything. So as I say, I think we won, and the next time we'll win.
See, that's just American optimism. Why do you think Americans are so optimistic, generally? I know it's not an easy question.
Perhaps it has to do with the way America was settled. You know, when the Puritans came over,
Yeah.
there was so much focus on the work ethic.
Mm-hmm.
And through the work ethic, capitalism. you can't be successful in capitalism if you're dour, if you're negative. You've got to be positive all the time. Then with the opening of the West, the pioneer spirit, you know, let's go open these barren lands and create new industries, new towns, new cities, etc. So I think there's always been a need for that because of the underpinning of capitalism.
Right, that's a very interesting perspective, because I do think it's discernible, and I think, you know, going back to the works of Thomas Paine, in terms of an empowered citizenry, it seems to manifest in this boldness of spirit and this optimism. I happen to love it, so I'm very grateful.
And let's not forget Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death.
Right.
So same time period.
So where does that take us in terms of the 2.1 million people that voted no?
I think we have two opportunities going forward, Kevin. One is to continue the education, because we found with the Yes campaign, statistically, the more people became informed, the more likely they were to vote yes. Secondly, we need to be much more aggressive in terms of pointing out all of these negative outcomes of the no vote. The unraveling of the social fabric, the destruction of life as we once knew it in Scotland. You know, people often ask me, Joe, what made you decide to vote yes years ago? And I said, I have a son. He works at the Festival Theatre as the marketing officer there. And he married a beautiful Scottish lass who we adore, Louise from Aberdeenshire, Balmetty. And I thought in reading my Scottish history about the clearances. And I thought about the tens of millions of young people who were forced to leave this country to seek work in Australia, New Zealand, Nova Scotia, North America, etc. I don't want to lose my family. I want my family to remain intact. I think a lot of Scottish people feel the same way, because families here are very important. It's one of the things that makes us unique as Scots. How many other countries in the world still have a Sunday roast?
Yes.
You know, where we go to Mama's house and as a family sit down for a meal. It's a wonderful thing. So I think we have to point out the fragility of that if we continue to let other people make our decisions.
Right, that's a very important point. I mean, that's kind of like the sentiment contained in Cap in Hand. I don't understand why we let someone else rule our land. That's the lyric from there. Let's come on to the recent findings by Professor Elsa Henderson in terms of the research that she produced. I don't know if you saw any of it yesterday. No, she said, amongst other things, she was looking at the demographic breakdown. Religious background had a lot to do with it. A lot of the members of the Church of Scotland voted no. Lots of women voted, more women voted no. A lot of young Catholic men voted yes. What do you make of that demographic analysis in terms of how we run the campaign going forward?
Well, we saw, and I can only give you anecdotal evidence from working as a volunteer for the last 2 years, the older, grayer of the voter, the more likely they were to vote no. And they tend to be the more devoted voters. They're the ones that are going to turn out in large numbers at the polls. So one of our challenges there is to get grandchildren talking to their grandparents. You may remember for the Olympic Games in 2012 in London, Her Majesty the Queen had a stunt double jump out of the helicopter, right?
Was it a stunt double?
Oh, I think it was. I think it was. Although, if Mr. Cameron had been in charge of it, given the mistakes that he made revealing his secret conversation, he might have been there pushing her out of the helicopter. I hope not, because I happen to be a fan of Her Majesty the Queen. But to make a long story short, I believe the way Danny Boyle was able to get the Queen to agree to participate in an opening ceremony, which remember the royal family had never done before except to pronounce the opening, was he had a wee chat with Prince William.
Right.
And he said, Prince William, the next time you're talking to Gran at the palace, tell her you think it's a good idea. Because did you know, Kevin, older people will do what their grandchildren ask them to do. They won't do what their own children ask them to do.
Well, I'm not sure.
Now, this worked effectively with the Obama campaign. There was a huge effort made through social media by Sarah Silverman, who's a comedian in the United States, to tell children, especially in Florida, grandchildren, because there are a lot of Jewish families who've retired to Florida. So she would say to them, call your Bubala, call your Zeta, tell them he's a good man, vote for Obama, they'll listen to you. So I think we have to have more intergenerational focus on this, having young people talking up to the older people. As far as women are concerned, having Nicola Sturgeon as our first minister was one of the most ingenious things Alex Salmond could have ever done.
It's not quite happened yet. I mean,
no, but it is logical that it will happen. And
right.
She is absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And how wonderful to have that succession plan in place. So we have someone who has the history and so on. She gets on very well with women's group. She gets on very well with young people, as she did at the Hydro when she had the debate. So I think everything is looking positive.
What about we have Angela Constance in tomorrow, and she's thrown her hat into the deputy leadership ring. So since we're on topic, what do you think in terms of Keith or Stuart or Angela? Have you got a preference?
I haven't made my selection yet because I want to go to the hustings and hear and flesh it out.
What do you want to hear from them?
I want to hear about, first and foremost, their commitment to a fully independent Scotland.
Right.
What I don't want to see is unraveling. I don't want to see people saying, well, first, let's try Devo Max and see how that goes. What I would like to hear is, okay, the other side won by a few percentage points this time, therefore we're going to see what powers are delivered. But I want to hear then, if those powers are not delivered, we will seek full independence, not seek further
Would you like them to
devolution.
Would you like them to map that out potentially?
Yes, absolutely, a plan. And that's the thing that I thought was so brilliant about our first minister. There was a plan, and the plan did not change. That's what integrity is all about in politics. You don't change your mind according to this poll or that poll. If you're elected based upon, I'm going to support independence, you remain constant towards that North Star.
Yeah, I suppose you have to adjust accordingly from time to time, but I mean, integrity in politics as in life, you do as you say you're going to do. I think it's an important point.
Well, we don't see much of that down south. We see a lot more of it up here.
Right. Now that's the nature of coalition politics. Are you thinking about the pledge for tuition fees, amongst others?
Absolutely.
Right, okay. And it's interesting they're based in Glasgow this week. And
or the NHS. You and I could go on and on about pledges that have been made and promises that have not been kept.
Down south?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I've happened to work in it twice, so I do have a wee insight into it. We're actually having Angela, and we hope to have Keith, and we hope to have Stuart in due course, so that it provides a platform from them to discuss their ideas in more depth going forward. In terms of your recent posting that you think the Edinburgh Festival, the Homecoming Scotland, the Commonwealth Games and the Ryder Cup will bring in excess of 500 million to this country. And the most significant event, you said, was the referendum. Yeah?
And it's an event. And unlike the others, it's an event without end. The senior vice president of Microsoft once gave a talk at the university where I'm appointed, and he didn't use PowerPoint.
Is that Washington?
Here in Edinburgh. And he did not use PowerPoint. And he started his presentation by saying, students, you're probably surprised because we are the manufacturers of PowerPoint, Microsoft. But look, you can access PowerPoint before, you can access it afterwards. What you can't access before or afterwards is a senior vice president at Microsoft.
Yeah.
I'm here with you now, let's talk. Well, with the referendum, it's an ongoing discussion. And once we become independent, which I believe we will be very soon, the transition period will be several years. So the spotlight of the world will continue to shine brightly on Scotland in a positive way, and that can only lead to more economic development through media coverage, through positive imaging, etc. Regarding your 500 million number.
No, hold on. You're 500 million.
Well, yes, the one you cited that I
Yes.
stated,
Yeah.
and I said I predict. It's
Right.
not a forecast. There's
Yeah.
a difference between a prediction and a forecast. My prediction is based upon the historic numbers. For example, the Edinburgh Festival's 158 million annual economic impact over many years. The homecoming celebration. In 2009, it was 50 million with 400 events delivered. Did you know, Kevin, they delivered 1,000 events this year? Yeah, the goal was 400, they delivered 1,000. So I'm predicting a higher economic impact.
How's
about
that
70
monetized,
million.
Joe?
In terms of economic impact?
Yeah.
Well, travel, accommodation,
Mm-hmm.
daily spend, media coverage, which can be, we call it comparable advertising value, where you measure if we had to pay for that advertising for national or international media, what would be the value of it?
All right.
So there are all kinds of metrics to measure economic impact, and then you add what's called the multiplier effect.
Mm-hmm.
So for that hotel room at the Balmoral in August at the Balmoral Hotel, which would be about £500 per night,
Oh, absolutely.
when you multiply it, it becomes £3,500.
Right.
6-7 times that amount as they pay their insurance company, their telecommunications provider, their food supplier, and so on. So you have the Edinburgh Festivals, you have Homecoming, you have the Commonwealth Games, you have the Ryder Cup, and I didn't even include in that 500 million the referendum. That's the elephant in the room.
How do you monetize that? Again, through...
Comparable advertising value is one way,
Mhm.
but the other way is to survey tourists and ask, what was the motivation for visiting Scotland? I think you'll be surprised at how many tourists will say, we didn't even know where Scotland was until this referendum. We thought it was somewhere in England, because in North America,
Yeah.
most people confuse Scotland with England,
Mhm.
and it's really put us on the map
It's the
as
same
a strong, potentially independent country.
It's the same confusion that exists in Westminster and the Tory party. They confuse Scotland and England quite easily.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
I suppose like games like Game of Thrones, or what's it called, the comparable advertising value that's set in Scotland too. I can't remember the name. It's a series on the telly as well. Those kind of things all feed into people coming here to visit, to see and to check out.
Absolutely. There are 3 reasons tourists generally decide to travel, motivations to travel. One is leisure. They want a break. Okay? They want something exogenous, exotic that they can go to. Well, Scotland is the perfect stage for both leisure, business, and event tourism, because we offer such diversity in terms of our topography, in terms of our climate.
I know that in terms, I was listening to the radio recently, in terms of Breaking Bad, they had the Mayor of Albuquerque on, and they were saying they had seen a real spike in tourist numbers.
Yeah.
But I can imagine if you're sitting in the heat of Albuquerque, then Scotland does seem really exotic.
And with global warming, we might become the Riviera of the European one day. It might look better and better.
That's some way off. I suppose it's political. We want to see an ongoing process towards independence. But if you're saying that it keeps the spotlight on us and we can potentially capitalise on it, what's not being done that could be done?
I think there are 2 things. There was a proposal for a constitutional convention. I'd like to see that progress. And I'd like to see it progress with young people. For example, we brought 7,000 young people to the Hydro for the debate. Let's bring another 7,000 back and have a real debate about what should be in a Scottish constitution, a written constitution, when we become independent. So that's number 1, to continue that discussion with key markets such as young people. The second thing is to link the aspirations that Scotland have as a people to the diaspora. One of the strongest motivations for visiting Scotland is ancestral tourism. People wanting to come and meet your family because they have links. You know, sometimes they're very fuzzy links, but they have links. And if we can capitalize on that through this political discussion to make them more connected to what they perceive as their homeland, I think that could result in recurrent tourism so that they come back every few years.
So you may be thinking perhaps to link the 2 points that they could have a constitutional position.
Absolutely.
Right.
So that they're linked constitutionally, they're linked politically, they're engaged throughout the diaspora.
But no representation without taxation, right?
Not yet.
Yeah,
Not yet.
If they want to pay for it, they can.
That's
they
right.
can then be represented.
Send your coins. We'll be
Yes.
happy to receive
Yeah,
them.
we'll be happy to take them
Yeah.
all over the place. I mean, that's an interesting development. Go on, sorry.
You know, some countries, Kevin, their tourism formula is not to have any visitors, just to have people send money because of the perceived destruction of tourism, parking problems, pollution, you know, etc. So they would like, in an ideal world, people to stay home and just send money. That's not what we want in Scotland. We love to welcome the world. In fact, that was our theme this summer with all of these events. Scotland welcomes the world. And why do we want to welcome the world? Because we need more economic development here. A man comes here, as happened to me this summer, a financial planner from my home state of Texas, and he looks at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe and he says to me, Joe, do you realize this is Adam Smith's capitalism at work?
Yep.
I said, what do you mean? He says, it's the invisible hand. I said, I'm so impressed, Michael, that you see that coming from the United States. He said, not only do I see it, but I'm going to go back and tell investors in the States they should invest in Edinburgh. They should invest in Scotland because there's potential here.
Yeah, and the invisible hand supported by state activity. I mean,
Yes.
the international festival was sponsored in the first instance.
Yes,
And some of the fringe venues are supported as well.
yes.
In terms of academics for Yes, you said earlier that you see their capacity to be developed in terms of refutation and taking the battle towards, well, the no camp as well. What were the no camp? Particularly where?
Well, I think there are 2 or 3 vulnerable places in the no camp. One is the leadership, because the leadership was not very eloquent, articulate, or consistent in their messaging. So I think that by seeking to shed more light on that leadership and the decisions that they make going forward will be very helpful. The second area that I think that can be addressed is with those vulnerable markets, or segments rather. One are older people, one are the university and college students. Interestingly enough, 16 to 18-year-olds voted no, but the 18 to 25-year-olds voted yes. So finding ways to penetrate that 16 to 18-year-old group, and then of course the senior group, as I mentioned earlier, by having grandchildren talk to grandparents or other, techniques. So finding areas that were weak and shoring them up, finding areas that were awkward, such as the leadership, and shining a light on that awkwardness so that either they step down out of embarrassment, out of missteps, etc., and they're replaced with others.
What about in the international sphere? Your own president, the president of the country of your birth, sort of nominally suggested that it would be a good thing if things stayed the same. How can the Scottish Government and all associated parties progress the case internationally, do you think?
This is a man who in my home country of the United States of America has a popularity rating in the polls hovering just under 30%.
Right. Okay.
So you're asking me if we should waste one moment of our precious time on the President of the United States, where in his own country less than 30% believe he's qualified to serve?
I'm assuming this is a no from Joe here.
This is a big no.
Right.
You may recall that I debated an American congressman on the BBC.
I did, yeah, I do remember that.
And that was a last minute call. They couldn't get anyone to do this, and I happened to live near the Ton, so they called and said, would you come on? So I went on with very little notice, and I do this quite a bit at the Ton, because living in the neighborhood, I can go over and fill in if they need somebody. And I turned to the congressman and I said, tell me about your experience with Scotland. Have you visited us? No. What do you know about Scotland? Well, I know that you're better together, and the Congress is going to table a motion on this.
Supported by about 27 fellows. That was it.
Yes. And I said to him, let me ask you a question about something you do know, your home state. You have a state with tens of millions of people, and you have 50 representatives in the U.S. Congress. If you use the same formula we have with Westminster, you'd have one representative. Is that sufficient to represent tens of millions of people in the state of California? And he said, and I'll never forget this, well, I think you have more than one person in Parliament. Well, of course we do. But we have one Tory that speaks for that government.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And then, of course, the BBC, in their wonderful fashion, cut us off the air before I could finish my point.
Now, isn't that wonderful? Because I was inevitably going to come on to the BBC. And so you felt as if the point that was relevant was cut off by the BBC?
Yes, because I was in the middle of a sentence when they decided to end the conversation. Whether they did that purposefully as an editorial choice for balance or accidentally, it doesn't matter. What's important is that it looked unprofessional. Because you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't cut off someone in the middle of a sentence.
Not knowingly, and
No.
certainly with Robert, and the other people here, I would imagine it'd be done very well and to a high standard. Professor Robertson, I mentioned earlier, was over here, and there's two things I want to talk about. One, his absolute belief in BBC bias is statistically proven as far as he's concerned. And the view of your fellow countrymen, because he quoted Noam Chomsky, who he had been in email communication with in terms of the referendum. I've mentioned there President Obama in terms of his non-committal views, it has to be said, whilst the congressman was passing a table based pretty much on ignorance. And we had a guy over here who was crowdfunded from the States to come across here, from the DC, from the Beltway area. He was, previously he had helped Obama's campaign, but he came over. So that's my three immediates in terms of American influences. So there's the American perspective of Scotland, that's one angle, and the other one is I want to just talk a wee bit more about the BBC. What do you think that does in terms of the campaign when the national broadcaster is perceived to be biased?
I can only again speak as a viewer of the BBC. I'm not an expert in terms of media analysis or media bias, etc. I do know the same thing occurs in the United States, most notably with Fox Television in the States. But here's what I perceive as a viewer. What I perceive is a persistent lack of respect for the people of Scotland through the reduced coverage that Scotland receives as compared to the rest of this land. And I find that frustrating because in the United States, the first 20 minutes of any news broadcast is local news. And when I say local news, I mean the village, the town, the state, not federal or international news. Whereas typically with the BBC, 75% of the broadcast is international, and then 25% is national. I see very little local news.
There's no percent left there, is there?
Well, that's it. I mean, one example, I spent the Olympic Games opening ceremonies. I was in Orkney, and I was watching the opening ceremonies on television, the London 2012 opening ceremonies produced by Danny Boyle, and the people in the room with me, I said to them, all Orcadians, so what did you think of those opening ceremonies? And they kind of took a sip of their whiskey and said,
Highland Park, no doubt.
where were we? I said, what do you mean? Orkney? No, no, no. Where was Scotland in the opening ceremonies of the London Olympic Games? If it was there, it went by in a flash. You certainly wouldn't be able to recount a scene, you know?
I'm trying to now and I
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah.
I can't at this moment.
So that's what I mean by bias. And by the way, that's influenced by the BBC because they don't just broadcast it, they help shape the story, the messaging, etc. The clips that are going to be used later.
Yeah, so it's kind of pre-edited out. It doesn't even
That's
get to
right.
the final cut. That's an interesting perspective. And the Arcadians would have sung that to you. They would have sung the response.
Where were we? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and they sing beautifully. Yeah.
Don't they just? In terms of your specialty of special planned events, what did you think of compare and contrast, if you will, the Commonwealth Games opening ceremony, which had its critics and its people who praised it, and the Olympic opening ceremony? Because at one stage it felt like people were saying, but the Olympic ceremony was very good too. What's your view?
Well, first we'll start with budget. The opening ceremonies and closing ceremonies for Glasgow was £18 million.
Right.
The opening and closing ceremonies for London was over £100 million. It started at 50, and then they added another 50 million at the request of Danny Boyle and others, Stephen Daldry, the director, you know, in the last few months to make certain that it was at a level that was competitive. And remember, they were following Beijing, which had an unlimited budget, right? Opening ceremonies, mega events, hallmark events, Kevin, are always highly politicized, highly criticized, because you have so many competing parts. You have the government wanting to tell one story, you have the athletes wanting to tell another story, the sanctioning body, the Olympic Games, the Commonwealth Games, another story. So there's always competing, you know, elements for these stories. I happen to know the producer of the Commonwealth Games personally. His name is David Zolker. He produced the opening ceremonies of Athens 2004 Olympic Games. He's produced 3 Commonwealth Games opening ceremonies. And I happen to be a fan of his work. When he produced the work in Glasgow, he of course wouldn't share with me what he was doing, nor did he ask my opinion. But the next day I wrote him an email after the opening ceremonies, and I said, I do believe you've surpassed in depth and breadth with this production all previous opening ceremonies I, as a scholar, have studied for 40 years. And here's why. 1, the UNICEF charitable appeal. There would be no ALS Ice Bucket Challenge if there had not been a Commonwealth Games UNICEF appeal, getting millions of people to text and raising millions of pounds for this wonderful charity. 2, in the closing ceremonies, the South African singer who sang Hamish Henderson's Freedom,
Come all ye.
Come all ye. I mean, I start to tear up now, and I'm not Scottish, but I just so love freedom. I've always believed that it is the absolute human right to be free. And to have a man writing that song in Gaelic, having it sung in Gaelic by a South African singer whose family knows oh so well the tragedy of apartheid and the brilliance and the integrity of Nelson Mandela. I do believe that we raised the bar in Glasgow.
I was moved there too, so I was caught for a moment there, so thank you for that. It's an interesting response and a passionate response. I enjoyed it, I have to say, immensely. I was very proud of Glasgow and proud of Scotland for putting it on the way it did. Coming to the perspective from America, as you know, we I don't know if you know, we did a live results show that was 8.5 hours long on the Thursday night through to the small hours of the Friday morning, 3 weeks ago now. And one of my fellow hosts was a guy called Will McLeod from Texas, and now living in the Beltway area of DC. And he was very passionate. He was committed to yes. It was interesting how it drew him as an American in, and he had written a fine piece to Netroots Radio, part of the Occupy movement in the US. John Robertson quoted Chomsky. I've mentioned President Obama. Have your friends been in contact with you from the States, proffering views of Scotland?
Yes, and that's why you asked me earlier about economic impact in the referendum, about engaging the diaspora. I've never seen anything so brilliant as the engagement from people who had only a minor understanding of Scotland, how it deepened their understanding of this land and its people and our aspiration. The morning after the referendum, I received hundreds of Facebook messages, not dozens, hundreds. So sorry. Great job. Keep up the good work. I felt as if the whole world was rooting for Scotland.
We had 54 countries viewing us at one stage.
But isn't that a wonderful feeling for a wee shiny place like Scotland, that the whole world is saying, come on, we know you can do it. Next time you'll get there. You know, we're sorry that you didn't quite make it this time. No, I think the referendum story will be one that in historical context will be remembered as a game changer for the way we feel about ourselves first, and the way people feel about us next.
How people perceive us externally.
Exactly.
And we can capitalize on that.
Yes. You know, as we talked about at the beginning of the program, in the States, my home country, if you meet someone in Texas, my home state, you say, "Hi, Kevin, how are you?" And Kevin says, "Just fine, how are you?" Now, he's not just fine. He's got a cold. He's having trouble with his wife, troubles at work. But he says, "Just fine, how are you?" because we're so positive. In Scotland, we say, "Not so bad." And that's the truth. What I love about Scots is we are direct to people. In other words, not brilliant, but not so bad. And I think the rest of the world has come to love that about Scotland.
There's an honesty.
The honesty, exactly.
There's an honesty and integrity. It's something you've spoken of often. Why do you think that's come about? The honesty and integrity.
I think it goes all the way back to Her Sainted Majesty Queen Margaret. This is the first monarch.
Is that the 12th century?
Yes, sir. Do you remember when she built that ferry for which we now name the bridge, the new bridge, Queen's Ferry? And she brought the pilgrims across from Fife?
I've read books about it, but
well,
I don't ever remember it.
No, but I know the story because of a university here named for her, Queen Margaret University, and how she said to King Malcolm, they want to worship. Let's help them worship. A very simple thing, freedom again, freedom of movement. And the state built a ferry, allowed them to come to Edinburgh and worship. So I think it's ingrained in our Scottish DNA.
It's an interesting perspective. I suppose, I read this morning, George Kerrivan, he's a former lecturer of mine. Do you know George?
I know him, yes.
So he did you read the article?
No.
It was an interesting and probably, from my view, the best post-indie view on the state of the parties and how things will progress. Now, there are 50,000 at last count. I don't know if Peter Morell's tweeted again the new number, but there's 50,000 new members joining the SNP. I think a doubling almost in the Green membership, and certainly a large number joining the SSP as well. The Tories, Labour and Lib Dems say they've got new members joining too, but are less forthcoming in terms of the numbers.
Yes.
How do you think the aftermath will affect the SNP in terms of the new members? And how do you see, we've touched on it in terms of the MPs, but how do you see it playing out politically?
Well, I can start first locally.
Good.
As I say, I'm a member of the exec of the SNP Central Branch. We had 400 members before the referendum. Now we have 1,200 members,
right.
tripling. We have meeting rooms that hold 60 people. A couple of weeks ago, we held a branch meeting. I was 30 minutes late because I was attending another event. There was a sign on the door. "Dear Joe, apologies, you can't come in. We've reached capacity." And I'm an officer of the branch. This is a good problem to have. Did you
Right.
know that?
Yeah.
But now we're talking about how do we engage these new members.
There's an extra
So-
£400,000 coming in from those because
That's
it's
right.
£12 membership fee.
That's right. One of the things that we'll be doing at our local branch is a membership survey to ask, how engaged do you want to be? Are you planning to stand for office? Are you planning on helping us campaign, canvass, man a stall, etc.? Do you wish to help us do fundraisers, social events, etc.? So we'll be doing a membership survey, electronic survey. And I think the parties that want to engage these new members need to do something very similar. They need to get to them fast. They need to be flexible with how they reformat their programs to bring these people into the big tent. And they need to be focused. And the focus for me is on independence.
For you, yes. But George was suggesting that because the Queen purred, according to David Cameron, on the result, that there might be moves from the new members towards a republic. What's your thoughts on that?
I don't believe that at all, and
Right.
here's why. The new members joined because of independence.
Right.
They didn't join because of Devo Max or because they were afraid of what might happen. They joined because they voted for independence and did not reach the mark this time. So their membership now is a sign of, let's take this further.
Right.
So I think if we at all backtrack away from independence, we'll lose them. And then maybe there'll be yet another party.
How will that change policy within the SNP, the SSP? Well, let's stay with the SNP because you know that. How will that change policy, do you think?
Well, I think that, first of all, Nicola Sturgeon has clearly stated that she will support independence, that this will be her prime objective.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Yeah.
And so I don't see any significant change in policy. What I do think will happen is that between now and either the next referendum or the parliamentary action, you're going to see a lot more grassroots engagement on the ground, liaising with these new members, asking them, what would independence mean for this country? And that's where I think a constitutional convention could be very successful.
That would be cross-party, presumably.
Yes, absolutely.
So there would be nominal agreements to what would be constituted.
Yes.
I do remember you were at the Botanics for the launch
Mhm.
of the Common Good
Yes.
by Elliot Bulmer.
Yes.
Are you thinking along those lines?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And you think that would then bring people more into the process because
Yes.
they would have a charter which says, look, this is what we're working
Yes.
towards.
Yes.
This is the Scotland we want. Back
Right.
to the realm of ideas again.
This is the one thing, our own Magna Carta for Scotland,
Right.
that we can all agree upon. We don't have to wait 800 more years, Kevin. We can do it now, and we should do it now.
I love the directness. I'm not sure. I suppose one of the things with the grassroots movement, Joe, that's important is how do we counter broadcasting and media bias? I mean, one of the reasons this show exists is because of broadcasting and media bias. So this is an answer in itself. The show is an answer in itself, as the station is. How else might it happen? How else might that be taken up?
Well, I think we need to identify those members of the media who maintain an objective opinion, and we need to, in some way, enlist them as advisors, as compatriots, as we move forward. Because the truth is, the media are not bad guys. The bad guys are the consumers. If we don't demand more from our media, as we did with the BBC recently with protests and people giving up their television licenses,
But they just ignore those.
etc. Yes, however, we can target those that are more objective with other media. It might be the STVs of the world, the Sky, etc., and use them as our forum. We may never change state television until we have our own state television.
Absolutely.
And that should be the ultimate goal.
Do you think that will come with the more powers?
Oh, no.
Oh.
But oh no,
Could you get any more emphatic?
because oh no, because the last thing government will give up is their communications ability with the mass market. That said, you may see a wee bit, but not enough.
Yeah.
We need a Scottish broadcasting company, and we need it now. So that when I watch my national news, I'm watching Edinburgh and Glasgow and Dundee and Aberdeenshire. I'm not only focused on the City of London.
The City of London's, yeah, it's a very powerful and influential place. But it will be the last to go. They won't give up that
Not
very readily.
at all.
So Broadcasting Scotland, us here, various other organisations, and the new paper, I think it's called the Scottish Independent, is due to come out amongst others, are way forwards to do that.
Absolutely, and they're natural and normal evolutions of a people who want to be free.
Yes, yeah, they begin to corrode the old order, erode the
Yeah.
old order, and replace it with something new. Just go back to America for a wee second. Your son, Max, is an actor,
Yes,
and he's on Broadway.
yes. Well, off Broadway.
What does that
This
mean?
will be his.
Off Broadway.
The difference between Broadway and off Broadway, we really don't have a what do you call it, a equivalent in the UK. You know, we have the West End, and then we have fringe theaters, I suppose. So off Broadway is the fringe theater of Broadway. It's a loose network of about 100 small venues that usually under 100 or so seats that put on some very serious and important work. In Max's case, he was nominated last year by the Alliance of Off-Broadway Theaters as the best family show in America for his work off-Broadway. His show is called The Amazing Max, and he now tours it all over the United States. I hope one day it'll come to Edinburgh. It's a children's magic show entitled The Amazing Max and His Box of Interesting Things. So it's a story. It's not just one magic effect after another. But I'll never forget in his show, he often concludes, or he concluded in the day that I saw it off Broadway, by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, people often wonder how I became a magician. Well, I had parents who told me I could be anything I wanted to be. I didn't have to be a doctor, lawyer, accountant. I could be anything I wanted to be. And here I am." And then he said, "And that's my father right there. Come up here, Papa." So later, I asked someone who had seen other shows, and I said, "Wasn't that nice of Max to put that in the show for me?" And he said, "He puts that in every show. That's a line in the show. I can be anything I want to be, thanks to my parents." And so I say to the people of Scotland, we can be anything we want to be. Let's listen to our parents. Adam Smith, Robbie Burns, David Hume, Francis Hutton. Let's listen to our parents and become the country that we must be for our children and our grandchildren.
I'm tempted to end the show there, but I can't quite yet. And you this week have attended your other son's event, which is what? Will you tell us?
Yes, Sam is the marketing officer at the Festival Theatre and King's Theatre here in Edinburgh, and they're now showing the Irving Berlin musical Top Hat. I went last night with my wife because it was opening night, and we were encouraged to come in white tie and tails, which we did.
Right.
She wore her tiara, and it was a glamorous, glorious evening, and at the end, 2,000 people rose to their feet and were stamping, and you know, that doesn't happen very often in Edinburgh theaters. It's a great show. But Sam is also a wee bit political. When Obama ran for president the first time, when we first moved to this country 7 years ago, he stood in Hubbard Square behind the Tron Church. And with a microphone before 200 people, he said, "I'm voting for Obama, and so should you." I thought that took a lot of nerve for a wee laddie from America to come here and to tell American expats to support.
Well, I think for me, we have to draw to an end shortly, Joe. For me, what's wonderful is the energy and passion of a man who's making Scotland his home, and his kids are making Scotland their home, committed to development of Scotland, and profiling Scotland increasingly in the world's view. It's been great to hear, and I look forward to it continuing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. That's all from Referendum TV today. I've just been interviewing the wonderful Professor Joe Goldblatt, and it's just been a wonderfully motivational experience. I think in part that's American, but I think in part it's the character of the man, Joe Goldblatt. Thank you very much.
Thank you.